The City Urchin and the Chaste Villagers. After the brief encounters between the hedge boy and Jimmy Trescott and the hedge boy and Willie Dalzell, the neighborhood which contained the homes of the boys was, as far as child life is concerned, in a state resembling anarchy. This was owing to the signal overthrow and shameful retreat of the boy who had for several years led a certain little clan by the nose. The adherents of the little community did not go necessarily to the boy who could whip all the others, but it certainly could not go to a boy who would run away in a manner that made his shame patent to the whole world. Willie Dalzell found himself in a painful position. This tiny tribe, which had followed him with such unwavering faith, was now largely engaged in whistling and catcalling and hooting. He chased a number of them into the sanctity of their own yards, but from these coigns they continued to ridicule him. But it must not be supposed that the fickle tribe went over in a body to the new light. They did nothing of the sort. They occupied themselves with avenging all which they had endured, gladly enough, too, for many months. As for the hedge boy, he maintained a curious, timid reserve, minding his own business with extreme care, and going to school with that deadly punctuality of which his mother was the genius. Jimmy Trescott suffered no adverse criticism from his fellows. He was entitled to be beaten by a boy who had made Willie Dalzell bellow like a bull-calf and run away. Indeed, he received some honors. He had confronted a very superior boy and received a bang in the eye which for a time was the wonder of the children, and he had not bellowed like a bull-calf. As a matter of fact, he was often invited to tell how it had felt, and this he did with some pride, claiming arrogantly that he had been superior to any particular pain. Early in the episode, he and the hedge boy had patched up a treaty. Living next door to each other, they could not fail to have each other often in sight. One afternoon they wandered together in the strange indefinite diplomacy of boyhood. As they drew close, the new boy suddenly said, "Napple?" "Yes," said Jimmy. And the new boy bestowed upon him an apple. It was one of those green-coated winter apples which lie for many months in safe and dry places, and can at any time be brought forth for the persecution of the unwary and inexperienced. An older age would have fled from this apple, but to the unguided youth of Jimmy Trescott it was a thing to be possessed and cherished. Wherefore this apple was the emblem of something more than a truce, despite the fact that it tasted like wet Indian meal. And Jimmy looked at the hedge boy out of one good eye and one bunged eye. The long-drawn animosities of men have no place in the life of a boy. The boy's mind is flexible. He readjusts his position with an ease which is derived from the fact, simply, that he is not yet a man. But there were other and more important matters. Johnny Hedges' exploits had brought him into such prominence among the schoolboys that it was necessary to settle a number of points once and for all. There was the usual number of boys in the school who were popularly known to be champions in their various classes. Among these Johnny Hedge now had to thread his way, every boy taking it upon himself to feel anxious that Johnny's exact position should be soon established. His fame as a fighter had gone forth to the world, but there were other boys who had fame as fighters, and the world was extremely anxious to know where to place the newcomer. Various heroes were urged to attempt this classification. Usually it was not accounted a matter of supreme importance, but in this boy life it was essential. In all cases the heroes were backward enough. It was their followings who agitated the question, and so Johnny Hedge was more or less beset. He maintained his bashfulness. He backed away from altercation. It was plain that to bring matters to a point he must be forced into a quarrel. It was also plain that the proper person for the business was some boy who could whip Willie Dalzell. And these formidable warriors were distinctly averse to undertaking the new contract. It is a kind of a law in boy life that a quiet, decent, peace-loving lad is able to thrash a wide-mouthed talker, And so it had transpired that by a peculiar system of elimination most of the real chiefs were quiet, decent, peace-loving boys, and they had no desire to engage in a fight with a boy on the sole grounds that it was not known who could whip. Johnny Hedge attended his affairs, they attended their affairs, and around them waged this discussion of relative merit. Jimmy Trescott took a prominent part in these arguments. He contended that Johnny Hedge could thrash any boy in the world. He was certain of it, and to anyone who opposed him he said, "You just get one of those smashes in the eye, and then you'll see." In the meantime, there was a grand and impressive silence in the direction of Willie Dalzell. He had gathered remnants of his clan, but the main parts of his sovereignty were scattered to the winds. He was an enemy. Owing to the circumspect behavior of the new boy, the commotions on the school grounds came to nothing. He was often asked, "Can you lick him?" And he invariably replied, "I don't know." This idea of waging battle with the entire world appalled him. A war for complete supremacy of the tribe which had been headed by Willie Dalzell was fought out in the country of the tribe. It came to pass that a certain half-dime blood and thunder pamphlet had a great vogue in the tribe at this particular time. This story relates the experience of a lad who began his career as cabin boy on a pirate ship. Throughout the first 15 chapters he was rope's-ended from one end of the ship to the other end, and very often he was felled to the deck by a heavy fist. He lived through enough hardships to have killed a battalion of Turkish soldiers, but in the end he rose upon them. Yes, he rose upon them. Hordes of pirates fell before his intrepid arm, and in the last chapters of the book he is seen jauntily careering on his own hook as one of the most gallous pirate captains that ever sailed the seas. Naturally, when this tale was thoroughly understood by the tribe, they had to dramatize it, although it was a dramatization that would gain no royalties for the author. Now it was plain that the urchin who was cast for the cabin boy's part would lead a life throughout the first 15 chapters which would attract few actors. Willie Dalzell developed a scheme by which some small lad would play cabin boy during this period of misfortune and abuse, and then when the cabin boy came to the part where he slew all his enemies and reached his zenith, that he, Willie Dalzell, should take the part. This fugitive and disconnected rendering of a great play opened in Jimmy Trescott's back garden. The path between the two lines of gooseberry bushes was elected unanimously to be the ship. Then Willie Dalzell insisted that Homer Phelps should be the cabin boy. Homer tried the position for a time, and then elected that he would resign in favor of some other victim. There was no other applicant to succeed him, whereupon it became necessary to press some boy. Jimmy Trescott was a great actor, as is well known, but he steadfastly refused to engage for the part. Ultimately, they seized upon little Dan Earl, whose disposition was so milky and docile that he would do whatever anybody asked of him. But Dan Earl made the one firm revolt of his life after trying existence as a cabin boy for some 10 minutes. Willie Dalzell was in despair. Then he suddenly sighted the little brother of Johnny Hedge, who had come into the garden and in a poor little stranger sort of fashion was looking wistfully at the play. When he was invited to become the cabin boy, he accepted joyfully, thinking that it was his initiation into the tribe. Then they proceeded to give him the rope's end, and to punch him with a realism which was not altogether painless. Directly he began to cry out. They exhorted him not to cry out, not to mind it, but still they continued to hurt him. There was a commotion among the gooseberry bushes. 2 branches were swept aside, and Johnny Hedge walked down upon them. Every boy stopped in his tracks. Johnny was boiling with rage. "Who hurt him?" he said ferociously. "Did you?" He had looked at Willie Dalzell. Willie Dalzell began to mumble. "We was only playin'. Wasn't nothin' for him to cry for." The new boy had at his command some big phrases, and he used them. "I am going to whip you within an inch of your life. I am going to tan the hide off in you." And immediately there was a mixture, an infusion of two boys which looked as if it had been done by a chemist. The other children stood back, stricken with horror. But out of this world they presently perceived the figure of Willie Dalzell seated upon the chest of the hedge boy. "Got enough?" asked Willie hoarsely. "No," choked out the hedge boy. Then there was another flapping and floundering, and finally another calm. "Got enough?" asked Willie. "No," said the hedge boy. A sort of war cloud again puzzled the sight of the observers. Both combatants were breathless, bloodless in their faces, and very weak. "Got enough?" said Willie. "No," said the hedge boy. The carnage was again renewed. All the spectators were silent but Johnny Hedge's little brother, who shrilly exhorted him to continue the struggle. But it was not plain that the hedge boy needed any encouragement, for he was crying bitterly, and it has been explained that when a boy cried it was a bad time to hope for peace. He had managed to wriggle over upon his hands and knees, but Willie Dalzell was tenaciously gripping him from the back, and it seemed that his strength would spend itself in futility. The bear cubs seemed to have the advantage of the working model of the windmill. They heaved, uttered strange words, wept, and the sun looked down upon them with steady, unwinking eye. Peter Washington came out of the stable and observed this tragedy of the back garden. He stood transfixed for a moment, and then ran towards it, shouting, "Hi! What's all dish here? Hi! Stop her dat, you two! For land's sake, what's all dish here?" He grabbed the struggling boys and pulled them apart. He was stormy and fine in his indignation. "For land's sake, you two kids act like you gwine mad dogs. Stop her dat!" The whitened, tearful, soiled combatants, their clothing all awry, glared fiercely at each other, as Peter stood between them lecturing. They made several futile attempts to circumvent him and again come to battle. As he fended them off with his open hands, he delivered his reproaches at Jimmy. "I's surprised at you. Certainly is." "Why?" said Jimmy. "I ain't done nothin'." "What have I done?" You done 'courage these here kids ter scrap," said Peter virtuously. "Me?" cried Jimmy. "I ain't had nothin' to do with it." "I reckon you ain't," retorted Peter with heavy sarcasm. "I reckon you been prayin', ain't you?" Turning to Willie Dalzell, he said, "You just take and run along outside this year, or I'll just naturally take and damn kill you." Willie Dalzell went. To the new boy, Peter said, "You look like you had some sayin's, but I reckon you don't know no more 'n a rabbit. You just take and trot along off home, and don't let me catch you round here fightin' or I'll break your back." The hedge boy moved away with dignity, followed by his little brother. The latter, when he had placed a sufficient distance between himself and Peter, played his fingers at his nose and called out, "Nigger! Nigger! Nigger! Nigger!" Peter Washington's resentment poured out upon Jimmy. "'Pears like you never would understand. You ain't regular common trash. You take and 'sociate with anybody what done come along." "Ah, go on," retorted Jimmy profanely. "Go soak your head, Pete." The remaining boys retired to the street, whereupon they perceived Willie Dalzell in the distance. He ran to them. "I licked him," he shouted exultantly. "I licked him, didn't I now?" From the Whilomville point of view, he was entitled to a favorable answer. They made it. "Yes," they said, "you did. And afore he knew what it was, I throwed him. And then it was easy." He puffed out his chest and smiled like an English recruiting sergeant. "And now," said he, suddenly facing Jimmy Trescott, "whose side were you on?" The question was direct and startling. Jimmy gave back 2 paces. "He licked you once," he explained haltingly. "He never saw the day when he could lick one side of me. I could lick him with my left hand tied behind me. Why, I could lick him when I was asleep." Willie Dalzell was magnificent. A gate clicked, and Johnny Hedge was seen to be strolling towards them. "You said," he remarked coldly, "you licked me, didn't you?" Willie Dalzell stood his ground. "Yes," he said stoutly. "Well, you're a liar," said the Hedge boy. "You're another," retorted Willie. "No, I ain't either, but you're a liar." "You're another," retorted Willie. "Don't you dare tell me I'm a liar, or I'll smack your mouth for you," said the Hedge boy. "Well, I did, didn't I?" barked Willie. "And what you going to do about it?" "I'm going to lam you," said the Hedge boy. He approached to attack warily, and the other boys held their breaths. Willie Dalzell winced back a pace. "Hold on a minute," he cried, raising his palm. "I'm not—" But the comic windmill was again in motion, and between gasps from his exertions, Johnny Hedge remarked, "I'll show you whether you can lick me or not." The first blows did not reach home on Willie, for he backed away with expedition, keeping up his futile cry, "Hold on a minute." Soon enough a swinging fist landed on his cheek. It did not knock him down, but it hurt him a little and frightened him a great deal. He suddenly opened his mouth to an amazing and startling extent, tilted back his head, and howled, while his eyes, glittering with tears, were fixed upon this scowling butcher of a Johnny Hedge. The latter was making slow and vicious circles, evidently intending to renew the massacre. But the spectators really had been desolated and shocked by the terrible thing which had happened to Willie Dalzell. They now cried out, "No, no, don't hit him any more. Don't hit him any more." Jimmy Trescott, in a panic of bravery, yelled, "We'll all jump on you if you do." The Hedge boy paused at bay. He breathed angrily, and flashed his glance from lad to lad. They still protested, "No, no, don't hit him any more. Don't hit him no more." "I'll hammer him until he can't stand up," said Johnny, observing that they all feared him. "I'll fix him so he won't know hisself, and if any of you kids bother with me—" Suddenly he ceased. He trembled. He collapsed. The hand of one approaching from behind had laid hold upon his ear, and it was the hand of one whom he knew. The other lads heard a loud, iron-filing voice say, "Caught ye at it again, ye brat, ye!" They saw a dreadful woman with gray hair, with a sharp red nose, with bare arms, with spectacles of such magnifying quality that her eyes shone through them like two fierce white moons. She was Johnny Hedge's mother. Still holding Johnny by the ear, she swung out swiftly and dexterously, and succeeded in boxing the ears of two boys before the crowd regained its presence of mind and stampeded. Yes, the war for supremacy was over, and the question was never again disputed. The supreme power was Mrs. Hedge.